All right, so get ready, because we're about to do a deep dive into Ludwig Wittgenstein, a guy who's considered by many to be like the most influential philosopher of the whole 20th century. And for a fellow philosopher like yourself, we're going to really unpack like why that is. We'll go beyond that surface level stuff.
You know what's so fascinating about Wittgenstein? It's how his thought evolved over time. And I think to really understand him, we need to trace that whole journey. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they break his work down into early, later, and get this even middle and post-later periods.
Okay, so we've got like a roadmap, which is super helpful. And we'll definitely be using that Stanford Encyclopedia entry as our guide. But we're going to go deep, on those concepts, especially those that are like most relevant to you, to your philosophical interests. And yeah, we're even going to tackle those intriguing metaphors he uses, like the pictures, the ladders, the fly bottles, and really see why they're not just quirky, but they're actually central to his whole philosophy.
Exactly. We're not just going for a philosophy 101 recap here. We're going to unpack those metaphors because they're not just illustrations. They're really tools for understanding his arguments.
Okay, so let's just start with early Wittgenstein and his groundbreaking work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which is, famous for its ambition to define the limits of language, thought, and even the world itself. Pretty bold goal, wouldn't you say?
It's incredibly ambitious, right?
Yeah.
Wittgenstein was trying to establish the boundaries of what can even be meaningfully said to separate sense from nonsense.
Okay, so at the heart of this whole project is his picture theory of meaning, right? And he argues that the world is actually made of facts, not just objects, right? It's the relationships between those objects, the states of affairs that, actually constitute facts.
Right, exactly. And language, according to the Tractatus, can represent those facts through a shared logical structure. That's what allows language and therefore thought to be pictures of reality. They actually mirror the structure of the world.
I'm already super intrigued by this whole idea of picturing the world. Can you give me an example of how this works?
Sure, yeah. Wittgenstein uses this really simple example. So imagine a builder's language with just 4 words. Okay. Block, pillar, slab, beam. And even with this really limited vocabulary, you can still represent complex facts about the world, like bring me the block. Pictures a different state of affairs than the block is on the slab. Different combinations of words represent different facts about the world.
Oh, okay. That's a really clear illustration. So how does this whole picture theory lead to those distinctions, between sense, nonsense, and senselessness? Those seem super crucial to understanding the Tractatus.
They are, yeah, they're really central. For Wittgenstein, propositions of natural science are the only ones that actually have sense. They're the ones that can be verified or falsified by, observing the world, by checking them against the facts.
Okay, that makes sense to me. But then we have this category of senselessness, right? What falls into that category?
So senseless propositions are those that are true, or even false, regardless of how the world actually is. Think of things like tautologies and contradictions in logic, right? They don't really tell us anything about the world, but they are important because they define the limits of what can be said. They're kind of like the scaffolding, but not the content of language.
And finally, the big one, nonsense, right? This is where things get, really interesting and maybe a bit controversial, right? It seems that Wittgenstein is relegating a lot of traditional philosophical questions to this realm.
He is, yeah, he's definitely doing that. Anything that can't be pictured, that doesn't have a corresponding fact in the world, it all falls into this category of nonsense. And that includes things like metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, even the idea of a subject itself. These are all things we might talk about, but according to the Tractatus, we can't actually talk about them meaningfully.
So all those big questions, that have occupied philosophers for centuries, questions about the meaning of life, the nature of good and evil, the existence of God. Is Wittgenstein really saying all of these are just nonsensical? That seems like a pretty radical position.
It is radical, for sure. He's drawing a line in the sand and saying, beyond this point, language loses its grip on reality.
But isn't there a problem here? If the Tractatus itself is making claims about the limits of language, isn't it, also engaging in nonsense? It seems to me like there's a kind of self-contradiction at play here.
Yeah, you've hit upon a key point there, the self-referential paradox at the heart of the Tractatus. Wittgenstein was definitely aware of this. His response is that the Tractatus is like a ladder that we use to climb to a clear view. And then once we've reached that view, we can discard the ladder.
So the book is meant to show us the limits of language. And then, having understood those limits, we're just supposed to move beyond language altogether, into some realm of silence maybe.
That's one way to interpret it. The Tractatus has generated like endless debate about how seriously we should even take this notion of nonsense. Is there truly something ineffable, something beyond language? Is the Tractatus ultimately a realist text, claiming that there's a world out there independent of language? Or is it anti-realist, suggesting that language shapes our reality? These are all live debates in Wittgenstein scholarship.
And even though the Tractatus seems, primarily concerned with logic, a lot of scholars have argued that there's a hidden ethical dimension to it. Perhaps this realm of silence you talk about, maybe it points to something about the limits of language when it comes to these ethical questions.
Absolutely. The Tractatus, despite its seemingly rigid structure, is open to a lot of interpretations. But, Wittgenstein himself, he didn't stay within the confines of the Tractatus forever. He eventually moved away from the strict system that he had created, and that's where the shift to later Wittgenstein comes in.
Right. And that shift is like a fascinating story in itself. It seems he wasn't afraid to question his own work, even a work as groundbreaking as the Tractatus. But before we dive into that, I kind of want to go back to that real anti-realism debate for just a second.
Of course, yeah. That's a crucial debate, and there are like strong arguments on both sides. For a philosopher like you, it's definitely worth unpacking those arguments in more detail.
Exactly. So let's take a closer look at what the Stanford Encyclopedia has to say about this.
So the Stanford Encyclopedia, it highlights this whole debate and kind of suggests that while the Tractatus leans towards realism with its emphasis on this world of facts, it also contains these seeds of anti-realism, that idea that language structures our understanding of reality. Well, that can be interpreted as, implying that we can't access a world beyond language.
That's a really subtle point. So some scholars argue that even though Wittgenstein talks about a world of facts, ultimately he's saying we can only, access those facts through the lens of language.
Precisely, yeah. And that's why the Tractatus just continues to spark these, really lively discussions. But as we move into later Wittgenstein, we see him kind of shifting away from this highly structured view of language and meaning.
It's almost as if he's, engaging in, a self-critique. What caused this shift in his thinking, do you think?
While Wittgenstein, he began to see the limitations of the picture theory. He realized it couldn't really account for all the complexity and messiness of how language actually works in our everyday lives.
So he moved away from this idea of a one-to-one correspondence between language and the world.
Yeah, exactly. And in his later work, particularly in philosophical investigations, we see him embracing a much more pragmatic and contextual approach to language. He famously declares meaning is use. So instead of searching for some abstract essence of meaning, he argues that the meaning of a word is really determined by how it's used in specific situations.
I can see how that's a huge departure from the Tractatus. But doesn't that make meaning incredibly subjective? How can we even have a shared understanding if meaning is totally dependent on individual contexts?
That's a really great question, and it gets to the heart of the challenges posed by later Wittgenstein. He actually uses this analogy of a toolbox to illustrate his point. Okay, so words are like tools. They have a variety of different functions. A hammer can be used to drive a nail, but it can also be used to break something or even just as a paperweight. We have to actually look and see how a word is being used in a particular situation to understand what it means.
So context is everything.
Yeah, context is definitely crucial, and this is where Wittgenstein introduces his concept of language games. He argues that we engage in all sorts of different language games, giving commands, asking questions, telling stories, making jokes, and each of these has its own, rules and conventions, its own way of using language to achieve a specific purpose.
So the same word can have different meanings in different language games. For example, the word red, it might mean something different in the context of a scientific experiment than it does in a conversation about, art.
Exactly, yeah. And this diversity of language games, it highlights the dynamism and flexibility of language. It's not this fixed system, but a constantly evolving set of practices.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to his idea that meaning is use. But how does Wittgenstein address the issue of, objectivity and meaning? If it's all about context, doesn't that lead to a kind of relativism?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting. Wittgenstein argues that while there's no, fixed essential meaning to words, there's still a way to ensure that we have a shared understanding, right? He points out that language games are governed by rules. They're not in a rigid or absolute kind of way.
So the rules are more like guidelines, maybe. They allow for flexibility in interpretation.
Precisely. And this brings us to another one of his key concepts in later Wittgenstein: family resemblance. He argues that we often understand concepts not by finding the single defining feature they all share, but by recognizing a network of overlapping similarities. Think about the concept of game. There's no one single characteristic that defines all games, but we can still recognize a game when we see one because of, the family resemblances between different types of games.
Okay, that's a helpful analogy. So instead of searching for the essence of a concept, we should be looking for the ways in which, like, different instances of that concept kind of relate to each other.
Exactly. It's a much more like nuanced and contextual approach to understanding meaning,
Yeah.
But it also raises some really important questions about how we follow rules and like how we know what it even means to follow a rule correctly.
Right, because if meaning is so fluid and contextual, how do we even know what it means to follow a rule? If any action can be interpreted as like following a rule, then how do rules have any power or like authority? This seems like it could lead to a very skeptical position.
This is the famous problem of rule following, one of the most debated aspects of later Wittgenstein. And you're right, it does raise some really serious questions about skepticism and the nature of meaning.
Yeah, I'm curious to know how Wittgenstein like addresses this problem. Does he offer a way out of this skeptical dilemma?
He does. It involves taking a closer look at how we actually learn and use rules. He argues that rule following, it isn't about some private mental acts of interpretation. It's more about a shared practice, a form of life.
So it's not about what's going on like inside our heads, but about how we actually interact with each other in the world.
Yes, exactly. And this leads us to his argument against the possibility of a private language.
Oh yeah, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of later Wittgenstein. How does he argue against this idea of a private language? What does he even mean by private language in the first place?
So for Wittgenstein, a private language is a language that can only be understood by the speaker. It's a language that's not subject to public criteria of correctness. He argues that such a language is actually impossible because there's no way to ensure that you're even using words consistently. To have a language, you need a community of speakers, a shared set of practices that allow for correction and understanding.
So even our inner thoughts, our most private experiences, they're actually shaped by the public nature of language.
That's the implication. We can't escape the social dimension of language, even in like our most solitary moments.
This makes me think about his concept of grammar. It seems that for later Wittgenstein, grammar is not about the rules we find in textbooks, but something much, much deeper.
You're right. Grammar, for Wittgenstein, it refers to the underlying structure of language, the rules that govern how words can be meaningfully combined and used. These rules aren't like explicitly stated, but are implicit in our use of language. They show up in, the way we form sentences, the kinds of questions we ask, the ways we even respond to each other.
So grammar, in this sense, it's not about being grammatically correct, but about the deeper logic of language, the rules that make communication even possible.
Exactly. And this deeper logic is rooted in what Wittgenstein calls forms of life. These are the shared practices, customs, values, and institutions that form the background of our language and actually make communication possible in the first place.
It seems that for later Wittgenstein, everything comes back to this idea of shared practices, of a common ground that allows us to understand each other. But does he see these forms of life as being culturally relative? Or are there universal forms of life that all humans share? This seems like a really crucial question, especially when we consider the implications of his work for, ethics and politics.
That's a question that, continues to be debated in Wittgenstein's scholarship. Some interpreters see him as endorsing a kind of cultural relativism, while others argue that he believed in certain, universal human characteristics that make language and communication possible. This is a debate that we could, definitely delve into further, but maybe we should move on to the later phases of Wittgenstein's work, where we see him continuing to wrestle with these ideas.
Yeah, you're right. We've covered a lot of ground with later Wittgenstein, but there's still more to explore. What happens after philosophical investigations? Does Wittgenstein just stop writing?
Not at all. He keeps writing, and his later work, sometimes referred to as post-later Wittgenstein, it grapples with some of the same themes we've been talking about, but from these, new angles.
So we have early Wittgenstein, later Wittgenstein, and now post-later Wittgenstein. It seems like his thinking is constantly evolving, always open to, new possibilities.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Wittgenstein was never content to just rest on his laurels. He was always pushing himself, always refining his understanding of language, meaning, and the world. And in his later work, we see him exploring some truly fascinating and challenging ideas.
Okay, so where do we even begin with this, like, post-later Wittgenstein? It feels like we're venturing into, like, uncharted territory here.
It's definitely a less explored area of his work, but
Mm.
that makes it all the more exciting for a philosopher like yourself. We see Wittgenstein really delving into these topics like aspect seeing, color perception, the foundations of knowledge.
I've always been so intrigued by his work on aspect seeing, especially that famous duck-rabbit illusion, where the same image can be seen as either like a duck or a rabbit. It just depends on how you look at it, right?
Yeah.
What's the philosophical, like, significance of beyond just being a clever visual trick?
Well, it really gets to the heart of how our interpretation shapes, like our whole experience. Wittgenstein argues that we don't just passively perceive the world, we actively construct it through our concepts and ways of seeing.
So it's not just about the object itself, but like our relationship to the object,
Yeah.
how we frame it within our understanding. This seems to connect to his later work on the nature of knowledge, particularly in uncertainty, right?
Absolutely, yeah. In Uncertainty, Wittgenstein tackles this whole problem of skepticism head on. He introduces this idea of hinge propositions, which are those basic beliefs that we just don't question, and they form the foundation of our knowledge.
So things like, I have a body,
Yeah.
or the world exists, beliefs that are so fundamental to our understanding of the world that we don't even think to doubt them.
Exactly. Wittgenstein argues that these hinge propositions, they aren't really justified by like evidence or argument. Instead, they're more like the bedrock, right? On which our entire system of knowledge rests.
It seems like he's trying to find a middle ground, between dogmatism and skepticism. He's acknowledging that there are some things we just have to take for granted to even make sense of the world, but he's not claiming that these beliefs are, like, absolutely certain or unchallengeable.
That's a really insightful observation. For Wittgenstein, certainty isn't about having irrefutable proof. It's more about a kind of lived confidence in our practices and ways of being in the world.
Okay, and how does remarks on color fit into all of this? It seems like a bit of a departure from his other work, focusing on this very specific phenomenon.
It might seem that way, but it's actually like deeply connected to his broader philosophical concerns. In Remarks on Color, Wittgenstein explores how language actually shapes our experience of color. He highlights the limitations of trying to define color concepts in purely objective terms.
So even something as, like, seemingly straightforward as color perception is influenced by language, by the ways in which we talk about color.
Exactly. Wittgenstein shows how our color concepts are intertwined with our practices, our ways of comparing and contrasting colors, our uses of color in like art and everyday life.
It's amazing how he consistently brings everything back to language and its role in shaping our understanding of the world.
Yeah, I think that's the thread that runs through all of his work, from the
Mm.
Tractatus to his later writings. Even though his thinking evolved dramatically over time, his focus on language as the key to understanding these philosophical problems, that remained constant.
It's been an incredible journey, like tracing the evolution of Wittgenstein's thought. What stands out to you most about his philosophical legacy?
For me, it's his unwavering commitment to looking at the particular,
Huh.
to paying attention to the details of how language actually works, rather than getting lost in those grand theories. I think it's a really powerful reminder for any philosopher or even just anyone trying to understand the world to be wary of these abstractions and to always return to the concrete.
Yeah, that's such a valuable lesson, and one that I'll definitely take to heart. As Wittgenstein famously said, philosophy leaves everything as it is, but even though it might not change the world directly, it can certainly change, our way of seeing the world, and
Oh,
that's no small feat.
absolutely. I think that's what makes Wittgenstein such an enduring and inspiring figure. He challenges us to think differently,
Mm.
to question our assumptions and to be open to these new ways of understanding ourselves and the world around us.
So well said. I really hope this deep dive has sparked some new insights for you and inspired you to, maybe explore Wittgenstein's work even further. There's always more to discover, more to ponder, and more to learn from this enigmatic and brilliant philosopher. Thanks for joining us.